In the famous Titanic story that has been passed down from generation to generation since that day on which the disastrous and most famous marine accident of the 20th century occurred in the unforgettable spring of 1912, perhaps one crucial but largely overlooked element in the whole mix is the ship that gave Titanic ship survivors a second chance on this planet. The RMS Carpathia is a ship that shortly became famous in that same year because she's the one that responded to midnight distress calls from the Titanic when it became apparent that Titanic was going down and her occupants needed to be rescued. Even though she responded to those calls immediately, the immense distance between her and the Titanic's sinking place hindered her from offering the most needed rescue on time, and when she arrived after cruising at full speed, she found that she was 1.5 hours late and just a handful of the Titanic's occupants were still alive.
Anyone alive out there? Can anyone hear me?
Then after these events, the Titanic story became much more famous as years went by, but it's only the Titanic ship that was largely talked about, with the RMS Carpathia and her role slowly fading from the story, or rather script. I bet you also didn't know that there once existed a ship called RMS Carpathia. So what happened to the RMS Carpathia and how did its story go after the Titanic tragedy had been settled and regarded as a thing of the past? Well, when the supposedly unsinkable RMS Titanic sideswiped an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland in the extremely chilly waters of the North Atlantic Ocean during her maiden voyage at around 11:30 p.m. on the clear moonless night of April 14, 1912, after 4 days of uneventful sailing from England to the United States, it didn't take long for reality to hit that unsinkable had been an unnecessary overstatement and exaggeration of the vessel, and as well an underrating of the ocean's might. The Titanic, which was the most coveted Royal Mail ship of the time, had a strong belief in her might that she dismissed some serious warnings and reports that she received from other vessels regarding the course she had taken, especially at her high speed, since some mildly drifting icebergs had been spotted on that path. Then, doomed as her voyage was, the luxurious ship couldn't withstand the assault by the iceberg, and in just a matter of a few hours, the ocean ghosts and sea demons came calling, and she was too powerless to tell them to back off and remain afloat after being overwhelmed by the chilly waters. Nearly perpendicular and with many of her lights still aglow, she bowed to the mightier Mother Nature and dove beneath the ocean's surface at around 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, taking with her more than 1,500 souls that were among the over 2,400 that had opted for her services in their attempt to cross the massive waters separating the two western worlds. In her downward spiral, the Titanic split into two halves and her wrecks went on different courses, settling 600 meters apart on the floor of the ocean that was 4,000 meters below the sea level. When dawn came, the RMS Carpathia, after receiving the Titanic's countless distress calls at midnight and steaming at full speed while dodging ice floes all night, arrived 1.5 hours after the Queen had sunk and rounded up all of the lifeboats, only to realize that they contained just 706 survivors, largely because the Titanic had lacked sufficient lifeboats to cater for her passengers and crew. So here is the story of the RMS Carpathia, how she came into existence and how she vanished from the face of the earth. The RMS Carpathia, that was 170 meters long, was constructed 10 years before the RMS Titanic by the British shipbuilder Swan and Hunter, and after all the necessary tests had been done, she made her maiden voyage on the 5th of May 1903 from Liverpool in England to Boston, Massachusetts in the United States, and for the better part of her life ran services between New York City and Mediterranean ports like Gibraltar, Algiers, Genoa, Naples, Trieste and Fiume. She was initially an intermediate liner designed mainly for second-class and third-class travelers, and her capacity was for 1,700 passengers, but subsequent renovations increased her capacity to 2,550 passengers, a number that was nearly equal to that of Titanic's 2,600. The RMS Carpathia had departed from New York City bound for Rijeka in Croatia on the 11th of April 1912, and her voyage was going well when she received a distress signal from the Titanic on the night of April 14. An earlier distress signal from the doomed Titanic had been missed because the Carpathia's wireless operator was on the bridge at the time it was made, but after receiving messages from Massachusetts in the US that Titanic was in distress, he contacted the Titanic at 12:10 a.m. on April 15, and in reply, he received the Titanic's distress signal, stating that they had struck an iceberg and were in need of immediate and urgent assistance. At first, there were some misunderstandings and disbelief among the Carpathia's crew regarding the distress signal, but when it became apparent that the message was serious, the Carpathia, which was nearly 108 kilometers away from the Titanic, turned around to go on a rescue mission. The Carpathia arrived at the distress calls position at 4 a.m., approximately an hour and a half after the Titanic had gone down, taking with her the 1,503 individuals. For the next 4.5 hours, the ship took on the 706 survivors of the disaster from Titanic's lifeboats, and the survivors were given blankets and coffee.
Well, keep checking them! Keep looking!
And then escorted by stewards to the dining rooms, but others went on deck to survey the ocean for any sign of their loved ones. Throughout the rescue, the Carpathia's own passengers assisted in any way that they could, offering warm food, beverages, blankets, accommodations and words of comfort. By 9 a.m., the last survivor had been picked up from the lifeboats, and the Carpathia's Captain Arthur Henry Rostron gave the order to sail away from the area with destination set for New York City, which was the original destination of the RMS Titanic. Slowed by heavy thunderstorms and fog since the early morning of Tuesday, April 16, Carpathia finally arrived in New York City on the evening of Thursday, April 18, 1912 under heavy rain. After this disaster, the RMS Carpathia returned to her normal operations, sailing between New York and the Mediterranean for about 2.5 years until World War I broke out. When the First World War broke out in July 1914, it not only altered the course of history but also the RMS Carpathia's literal course. During the war, the RMS Carpathia was used to transfer Canadian and American expeditionary forces to Europe, sailing from New York through Halifax to Liverpool and Glasgow. Then on the 15th of July 1918, the Carpathia departed from Liverpool, England, in a convoy bound for Boston carrying 57 passengers and 166 crew. The convoy traveled on a zigzag course along with an escort in accordance with procedures against submarine attacks that were prevalent in that war. The Carpathia was the largest ship in that convoy of 6 other ships, and at 9:15 a.m. while sailing in the southwest approaches on July 17, a torpedo was sighted approaching on her port side, and in response her engines were thrown in full astern and the helm was turned hard a starboard, but it was too late to avoid the torpedo. The Carpathia was torpedoed near the number 3 hatch on her port side by the Imperial German Navy submarine SMU-55, followed by a second which penetrated the engine room, killing 3 firemen and 2 trimmers, effectively disabling her ability to escape as the engines were rendered inoperable by the second torpedo's impact. The explosion severely damaged the Carpathia's electrical gear, including the wireless radio apparatus, as well as 2 of the ship's lifeboats. As a result, Captain William Prothero, who had been in command of the Carpathia since 1916, signaled the other ships in the convoy to send out wireless messages by use of flags. He then had rockets fired to attract the attention of nearby patrol boats, and the remaining convoy steamed away at full speed to elude the submarine. Prothero then gave the order to abandon ship, and all passengers and the surviving crew members boarded the 11 lifeboats available as the Carpathia sank. There were 218 survivors of the 223 aboard, and as the passengers and crew disembarked, Prothero, the chief officer, first and second officers and the gunners remained on the sinking ship to see to it that all the confidential books and documents were thrown overboard. The captain then signaled one of the lifeboats to come alongside, and he and the remaining crew members abandoned their ship, but the U-55 surfaced and fired a third torpedo into the ship near the gunners' rooms, resulting in a massive explosion that doomed the Carpathia for good. The notorious U-55 started approaching the lifeboats when HMS Snowdrop arrived on the scene and drove away the submarine with gunfire before picking up the survivors from the Carpathia at around 1 p.m. to take them back to England. The HMS Snowdrop arrived back in Liverpool with the survivors on the evening of July 18, but the RMS Carpathia had sank at 11 a.m., landing upright on the seabed at a position recorded by the HMS Snowdrop as 49 degrees 25 and 10 degrees 25 feet W, about 1 hour and 45 minutes after the torpedo strike and approximately 190 kilometers west of Fastnet.